Jasmine Reed stepped onto the plane with the kind of calm that draws attention without demanding it. Dressed in a tailored navy blazer over a soft cream blouse and crisp trousers, she exuded quiet professionalism. Her natural curls framed her face elegantly, and in one hand she held a sleek leather laptop bag. In the other, her boarding pass. She offered a courteous smile to the gate attendant as she was directed to her seat in first class. Though she moved with quiet confidence, there was no trace of arrogance, just a calm, assured presence that suggested she belonged exactly where she was. As Jasmine made her way down the aisle, the hum of conversations and overhead announcements seemed to fade behind her. She glanced at seat numbers with practiced ease, her posture upright but unassuming. Upon reaching her assigned spot in 2A, she gave a polite nod to the older gentleman seated beside her, then tucked her bag neatly into the overhead compartment. Her movements were smooth, unhurried, and deliberate. Once seated, she pulled a small notepad and pen from her purse and began jotting notes, her brows slightly furrowed in focus. To anyone watching, she was just another professional traveler preparing for a work trip. But not everyone saw her that way. From a few rows back, Kelly Monroe, a senior flight attendant known for her sharp efficiency and strict adherence to perceived norms, took notice of Jasmine Kelly's eyes narrowed slightly, not in recognition, but in speculation. Something about Jasmine, perhaps her age, her appearance, or simply her presence in first class, sparked a quiet judgment. Kelly began making her rounds through the cabin, greeting passengers and checking on boarding procedures, but her gaze kept drifting back to Jasmine with a hint of suspicion. When Kelly finally approached her, smile was tight polite, but lacking warmth. "Good afternoon," she said, stopping beside Jasmine's seat. "May I see your boarding pass? Please." Jasmine looked up slightly surprised, but not alarmed. She handed over the pass without hesitation, her expression neutral. "Of course," she replied. Kelly scanned it, her brow furrowing slightly as she read the clearly printed details confirming Jasmine's first-class seat. "This is for first class," she asked, her voice dipped with forced courtesy. "Yes," Jasmine answered, her tone calm but firm. "That's correct." Kelly paused, lips pressed into a thin line before handing the pass back without another word. Her demeanor remained polite on the surface, but there was an unmistakable edge in her voice and body language. She moved on quickly, but not before throwing a final glance over her shoulder at Jasmine, as if the presence of this composed black woman in first class was something to be double-checked if not corrected. Jasmine, meanwhile, resumed writing in her notepad, choosing to dismiss the strange interaction for now. She was used to these moments, microaggressions dressed in manners, but she refused to let them shake her. As the cabin settled and boarding announcements continued, Jasmine stayed focused on her notes. She was outlining ideas for an upcoming leadership conference. She was set to speak at one of several in her busy schedule as a rising executive in the tech industry. To her, this flight was simply a short reprieve between meetings, but unbeknownst to her, it would soon become the catalyst for something far greater than a travel inconvenience. While she remained immersed in her work, Kelly was speaking quietly to another flight attendant by the galley, her voice low, but her eyes still fixed on Jasmine. Something was brewing, and Jasmine was about to be forced into a role she hadn't asked for, but was more than prepared to handle Kelly. Monroe returned 10 minutes later, her demeanor sharper, her posture more rigid. She didn't smile this time. Her voice was clipped professional on the surface, but carried a chill that was hard to miss. "Ms. Reed," she began, standing just beside Jasmine's seat in first class. "Could I have a word with you near the galley?" "Please." Jasmine looked up, eyebrows slightly raised. Her pen paused mid-sentence. There was no urgency in her movements, just calm curiosity. "Certainly," she said, closing her notebook and gathering her bag. As she followed Kelly down the narrow aisle, a few heads turned. Something about the moment felt off, and it wasn't just the interruption. They stopped near the back of the first-class cabin, just shy of the galley. Kelly folded her arms across her chest and lowered her voice. "It appears there may have been a booking error," she said. "Your name doesn't seem to match what we have for seat 2. Jasmine blinked, her expression still composed. "That's not correct," she replied calmly. "I booked this seat 2 weeks ago. and I have the confirmation on my phone. I also checked in this morning with no issue." She reached into her bag, already opening her email app, but Kelly raised a hand, cutting her off. "We've already double-checked the manifest. I'm going to have to ask you to relocate to a seat in the main cabin." For the first time, a trace of disbelief crossed Jasmine's face. Her words, however, remained steady. "With all due respect, Miss Monroe, I'm not moving unless there's a valid reason I paid for that seat. I boarded with no issue. You've seen my ticket." Kelly's expression didn't change. Her eyes narrowed slightly, her tone losing its thin veneer of politeness. "This seat isn't appropriate for you," she said, the implication lingering in the silence. Jasmine stood her ground for a moment longer, the weight of those words hanging between them like a fog, but then slowly she exhaled and nodded. "Very well," she said, not with defeat, but with a deliberate choice not to escalate. Her voice, as always, was quiet and composed. As they walked back through the first-class cabin, Jasmine could feel the weight of the stairs behind her. Some passengers averted their eyes, others watched openly. Whispers began to ripple through the rows, hushed but unmistakable. Jasmine didn't respond. She didn't glare, she didn't cry. Her shoulders remained squared, her back straight. She walked with the grace of someone who had learned long ago that dignity wasn't granted. It was maintained. Her laptop bag swung gently by her side as she followed Kelly toward the middle of the plane. No one offered help. No one questioned what was happening, and that silence spoke volumes. Kelly gestured toward an empty seat in economy row 22, a cramped spot in the middle between two already seated passengers. "You can sit here," she said, her voice now devoid of even the pretense of civility. Jasmine stepped in, placing her bag under the seat in front of her with careful precision. She thanked the man who stood to let her pass, then sat down, smoothed her jacket, and took a quiet breath. The hum of the engine filled the space around her. She looked out the window, her reflection faint against the bright blue sky. From the outside, she seemed unbothered. But inside, Jasmine was already setting wheels in motion. She reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. Her thumbs moved swiftly across the screen as she typed a short message. "Initiate review. On board. Now. Standby." She hit send, then locked her phone and placed it carefully back in her lap. A knowing calm settled over her features, like someone who had just pressed the first domino in a much larger chain. Around her, a few nearby passengers offered her sympathetic glances, but no one spoke. Jasmine didn't need their sympathy. She needed precision, she needed patience, and most importantly, she knew who she was. This wasn't the first time someone had underestimated her, and it wouldn't be the last. But this time the consequences would be different. The seat in economy was narrow and lacked the space Jasmine was used to. But she made no complaints. She adjusted her posture with precision, crossing her legs neatly and folding her hands in her lap. Her face remained composed, betraying no trace of the insult she'd just endured. As passengers continued to board and settle, the chatter around her grew louder, but Jasmine remained still. Then, as if following a silent cue, she slipped her phone from her bag, shielding the screen subtly with her hand. Her fingers moved swiftly across the glass. The message was short, clean and precise, sent to a private number marked simply as a Chambers. It read, "On board, incident underway, request full review, maintain discretion." Once sent, Jasmine locked her phone and returned it to her bag without so much as a glance around. She didn't need to see who was watching her. She already knew. Moments later she could feel it. The stares, the uneasy glances. Even in the insulated hum of the cabin, she could sense the weight of curiosity pressing in from both sides. A middle-aged woman to her right shifted uncomfortably in her seat. A man across the aisle pretended to read his magazine but kept stealing glances. To them, Jasmine's calm composure didn't make sense. She wasn't angry, she wasn't visibly shaken, and that more than anything made people uncomfortable. People expect outrage. They don't know what to do with poise. Farther down the plane, Kelly Monroe poured orange juice into plastic cups with robotic efficiency. Her movements sharper now, more agitated. She had tried to brush off the earlier exchange, but something about Jasmine had unsettled her. The way she had stood there, elegant, unyielding, and entirely too calm, gnawed at Kelly's confidence. First-class passengers didn't usually react that way. They either demanded attention or melted into silence. Jasmine had done neither. Kelly glanced down the aisle toward the economy section, but couldn't see Jasmine from her vantage point. Still, her unease lingered like a shadow she couldn't shake. Back in seat 22B. Jasmine pulled her notepad from her bag again, flipping to a fresh page. She wrote slowly, now not with urgency, but with intent. A name, a time, a date. Then she paused, eyes lifting to the cabin ceiling, as if calculating something. After a beat, she placed her pen down and reached for her phone once more. This time she made a call, her voice low and measured, barely carried above the ambient noise of the cabin. "Hey, it's me," she began. A pause, then a calm inhale. "There's been a situation on board, Flight 318. I'd like it documented in full." "No, not yet. Don't escalate anything until I say, just prepare the team." Another pause. "You'll know when the call ended as quietly as it began." Jasmine returned her phone to her bag and resumed her composed posture, hands resting softly on the notebook in her lap. Her demeanor hadn't changed. There was no tension in her shoulders, no fidgeting, no flushed cheeks, just grace. If anyone noticed the call at all, they would have mistaken it for a casual check-in. But the wheels were turning. Jasmine wasn't someone who let disrespect go unanswered. She was someone who believed in accountability, not in spectacle, but in structure. And she had just activated a structure most people on that plane didn't even know existed. By now, the cabin had settled into that quiet rhythm familiar to frequent flyers, a mix of soft conversation, the occasional ding of a seatbelt sign, and the faint rustle of newspapers. To an outsider, it was just another flight. But to Jasmine Reed, this was a moment of transformation. She had been publicly challenged, and she was choosing to respond not with anger, but with strategy. As she sat in that cramped seat, looking no different than any other passenger, she was already orchestrating a chain of events that would ripple far beyond that aircraft. A plan was in motion, and Jasmine, calm and steady, was already 5 steps ahead. Kelly Monroe moved through the first-class cabin with a renewed sense of control. The tightness that had lingered in her chest earlier seemed to ease with every step she took. In her mind, the problem was resolved. The woman in 2A had been relocated and the integrity of the cabin preserved. She adjusted the cuffs of her uniform and greeted the remaining passengers with exaggerated cheer, pouring drinks and offering hot towels, as if nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. A small smirk played at the corner of her lips when she caught a glimpse of the now vacant seat where Jasmine Reed had been sitting. To Kelly, she had asserted the unspoken order of things, and she believed she had done so effectively. Further back in the cabin, the energy was different. Jasmine sat in seat 22B, still as composed as ever. The narrow seat didn't suit her stature, but she made no complaint. Her hands rested on her notepad, and her gaze was focused on the clouds drifting past the window. There was no sign of agitation, no resentment in her expression. But those who noticed her couldn't help but feel something, an aura of control, an elegance that didn't match the seat assignment. It was in this moment that Emily Ross, a junior flight attendant with a softer presence and more empathetic eyes, took notice. Emily had witnessed the earlier exchange from a distance and had felt a quiet discomfort ever since she now approached Jasmine cautiously, holding a cup of water in both hands. "Excuse me, ma'am," Emily said gently, her voice just above a whisper. "Would you care for something to drink? Water juice?" Jasmine turned toward her, her smile immediate and warm, despite everything. "Water would be lovely. Thank you," she said. There was no trace of irritation in her tone, only a calm grace that made Emily pause for a moment. She placed the cup on Jasmine's tray with care and hesitated before stepping away. "If there's anything else I can do for you, please don't hesitate," she added quietly. Jasmine gave a small nod, her smile appreciative. "Thank you, Emily. You've been very kind." The acknowledgement, though simple, carried weight. Emily walked away slowly, casting one last glance over her shoulder. There was something about Jasmine that stirred something deep, a sense of respect, of admiration even. In an environment where silence was often safer than kindness, Jasmine's quiet strength spoke volumes. Though she had been publicly slighted and wrongly displaced, she held her posture like a queen on a borrowed throne. She didn't demand attention, yet she drew it all the same. Several passengers around her had taken notice as well. They didn't speak, but their eyes said enough. They saw the dignity, they saw the difference, and they were beginning to understand that this story wasn't over. Meanwhile, Kelly remained in the front of the plane, fully unaware of the undercurrent her actions had stirred. She checked the galley, made a note on her clipboard, and prepared the next round of beverage service. She laughed lightly with another attendant, trying to brush away the earlier tension as if it had never existed. Her sense of triumph insulated her from reflection. She believed she had done the right thing, acted on instinct, protected the sanctity of first class, and yet a part of her buried just beneath the surface wondered why Jasmine hadn't pushed back harder. Why had she been so calm? Why hadn't she demanded a supervisor or made a scene? That lack of resistance, that composure made Kelly uneasy in a way she couldn't articulate. But for Jasmine, it was never about reacting. It was about responding. She had nothing to prove in a loud display. She had already proven it in the way she carried herself, in the precision of her words, in the quiet call she had made minutes earlier. As she took a sip of her water and glanced around the cabin, she wasn't thinking about vindication. She was thinking about timing, and she knew that the time would come, not through confrontation, but through process. Her grace wasn't passive, it was calculated, intentional, a kind of patience sharpened by experience. And while Kelly continued on, blissfully unaware of the consequences inching closer, Jasmine waited, calm, collected, and completely in control. Jasmine Reed sat quietly in seat 22B, her posture relaxed, but her eyes sharp with intent. The hum of the engine was steady, the cabin calm, but inside her mind the gears were already turning. She reached for her phone once more, careful to shield the screen from wandering eyes. The message she typed was brief, almost unremarkable in its simplicity. "They'll call soon." With a single tap, it was gone, dispatched to someone whose job wasn't to ask questions, but to act. Jasmine didn't need to explain the context. The events of the past 30 minutes had been more than enough. Her composure never faltered, but behind it was a plan set in motion with the precision of a well-oiled machine. In the airline's corporate headquarters, far from the mid-air silence of Flight 318, the ping of that message triggered immediate protocol. Jasmine Reed wasn't just another traveler, she was a major stakeholder in Skylink Aviation, a strategic advisor and equity partner known for keeping a low profile but holding tremendous sway. Within minutes, a communication analyst escalated the alert to the chief passenger relations officer, who then looped in the executive flight liaison. It wasn't the first time Skylink had received feedback mid-flight, but this case came with a directive from the top: handle it discreetly and get eyes on the situation now. Within 7 minutes of Jasmine's message, a secure call was placed directly to the flight's cockpit. Captain Harris had flown for Skylink for nearly 2 decades. Calm, competent, and not easily rattled, he answered the flashing call, light in the cockpit with a steady voice. "Flight 318, Captain Harris speaking." On the other end was someone from Skylink's executive support desk. "Captain, we've received a high-priority notice involving a passenger seated in the main cabin, Ms. Jasmine Reed. We've confirmed she was reassigned from first class. Can you verify the details?" Harris's brow furrowed. "Stand by," he said, covering the receiver. He called for Kelly Monroe to join him near the galley, with a firm tap on the cabin intercom. When she arrived, clipboard in hand, he didn't waste time with pleasantries. "There's been a complaint," he began, "from a first-class passenger who was moved, Jasmine Reed. Do you know anything about it?" Kelly's shoulders stiffened. She tried to keep her face neutral, but a flicker of alarm passed through her eyes. "Yes," she said cautiously. "There was confusion with the seat assignment. I handled it." Harris didn't blink. "Handled it how?" She explained the supposed booking error, choosing her words carefully, but something in her tone betrayed her discomfort. Harris narrowed his gaze. That woman is a board-level partner. They're asking for a full account of the incident. Now the words hit Kelly like a gust of cold air. Her throat went dry. As Kelly returned to the front of the cabin, her mind was racing. She had assumed Jasmine was just another young woman sitting where she shouldn't have been. She hadn't bothered to ask questions. And now, not only was Jasmine someone with influence, she was someone powerful enough to make the phone ring mid-flight. Kelly tried to resume her duties, but her hands trembled slightly as she refilled a passenger's water glass. She forced a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. Something had shifted, and she knew it. That smug certainty she had worn earlier was unraveling thread by thread, and the worst part, Jasmine hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't made a scene, she had simply waited and moved. Back in row 22. Jasmine sat quietly, her expression unreadable. She knew the message had gone through. She knew the wheels were now turning behind the scenes. She didn't check her phone again. There was no need. Her role in this part of the process was done. The system she had helped build was working as it should. The crew wouldn't know yet just how far-reaching her connections were or how carefully she had constructed the support around her position at Skylink. And she wasn't interested in parading her authority. That wasn't her style. Her style was the long game, the invisible lever, the quiet shift. And now the shift had begun. Kelly Monroe stood stiffly near the galley, pretending to adjust a tray of sparkling water bottles as her mind spun. The earlier confidence that had bolstered her through the first half of the flight was now quickly eroding. She had tried to dismiss the captain's words, chalk them up to an overreaction, but the tightness in his voice and the precision with which he'd said board-level partner haunted her. She hadn't just made an awkward decision. She might have crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. As she tried to regain her composure, Dennis Clark, the most senior crew member on board, walked into the galley with his usual quiet authority, a 30-year veteran of Skylink Aviation. Dennis wasn't one to interfere unless it truly mattered. He didn't speak right away. He simply picked up a stack of cups and began arranging them in the drawer. Then, without looking up, he said evenly, "I heard there was a call from HQ." Kelly stiffened. "Just a routine follow-up," she replied too quickly. Dennis gave her a sidelong glance. "You sure about that?" Kelly didn't answer. She was staring at the cabinet door, her fingers gripping the edge tighter than necessary. "Kelly?" Dennis continued more gently this time. "I don't know what happened earlier, but I've seen a lot of mistakes in this job, the kind you learn from and the kind that end careers. If the name they mentioned was Jasmine Reed, you might have made the second kind." The galley felt colder now, more confined. Kelly's throat tightened. She glanced down the aisle toward the main cabin, but she couldn't see Jasmine from where she stood. Not that she needed to. Jasmine's silence said enough. The way she hadn't fought back, the way she'd complied and disappeared into the back rows, it hadn't been submission. It had been strategy. Kelly began to realize something she hadn't before. This wasn't a woman caught off guard. This was someone who had allowed her to make a mistake, someone who knew the weight of patience and the power of silence. Kelly looked at Dennis again. "I didn't know who she was," she said quietly. I thought Dennis raised a hand. "Doesn't matter who you thought she was. What matters is how you acted." He let the words hang for a moment, then added, "And how you fix it." As if on cue, the intercom in the galley buzzed again. The captain's voice was low steady, but now unmistakably formal. "Miss Monroe, please report to the cockpit." Kelly's heart dropped. She swallowed hard and nodded, then stepped past Dennis toward the flight deck. Every step felt heavier than the last. When she entered, Captain Harris didn't look up right away. He was listening intently to the headset, scribbling something into his flight log. Then he met her gaze. "We received a second call," he said, this time from the executive office itself. Kelly's legs almost gave out beneath her. She gripped the side panel of the cockpit to steady herself. Captain Harris continued his tone flat. "They confirmed Ms. Reed's position. She's not just affiliated with the board. She's part of the Executive Development Council. She's one of the architects behind our passenger equity policies. They want a full incident report by touchdown, and they want her treated with the utmost respect from this point forward. Kelly didn't respond. She couldn't. Her mouth had gone dry. She simply nodded, her eyes fixed on the carpet as the reality hit her. She hadn't just mishandled a passenger, she had publicly disrespected the woman who helped design the very guidelines she'd violated. When she exited the cockpit, Kelly could barely catch her breath. The smile she usually wore so effortlessly was gone, replaced by a mask of unease. Her steps were quicker now, less graceful as she made her way through the first-class cabin. But no amount of urgency could undo what had already been done, and she knew deep down that Jasmine Reed had never needed to raise her voice. All she had needed was the truth, and the truth was already airborne, moving faster than any apology Kelly could offer. It was too late to rewrite the story. All she could do now was brace for the ending. Jasmine had already begun writing. The door to the cockpit clicked shut with a gentle but resolute finality, and for a moment the small space was wrapped in a heavy silence. Kelly Monroe stood just inside her, back straight, hands clasped behind her like a student summoned by a disappointed teacher. Captain Harris turned toward her with an expression that betrayed no emotion, but his eyes told a different story, sharp, watchful, and laced with disappointment. He motioned for her to sit in the co-pilot's unused jump seat. "We need to be absolutely clear about what's happening," he began, voice low and firm. "You didn't just move a passenger from first class. You moved Jasmine Reed." Kelly blinked the name. Still hanging in the air like a fog, she couldn't quite clear. "Yes, sir," she said carefully, her voice tight. "I didn't know. She's not just a passenger." The captain cut in, leaning slightly forward. "She sits on the executive stakeholder board for Skylink Aviation. She's been instrumental in drafting several of our diversity and equity policies, ones you're expected to follow every time you put on that uniform." The words landed like a gut punch. Kelly looked down at her lap, her breath shallow. She had underestimated the very woman whose influence helped shape the policies that determined her own career. It wasn't just embarrassing, it was catastrophic. Captain Harris didn't soften. "From this point forward, you are not to speak to Ms. Reed again at all, unless it's an absolute emergency," he said. "Do you understand?" Kelly nodded slowly, the heat rising in her cheeks. "Yes, Captain." "Furthermore," he added, "you'll be compiling a written incident report immediately upon landing. I'll file a secondary report with flight operations myself. Headquarters is watching this situation closely now. They've already flagged the flight for executive review." There was no dramatic outburst, no grand rebuke, but the quiet certainty in the captain's voice made it clear the spotlight was now fully on her and there would be no escaping its glare. As Kelly stepped out of the cockpit and into the corridor, she felt the air shift around her. Nothing in the cabin had changed visually. The same rows of seats, the same gentle hum of jet engines, but it all felt different. Every footstep felt heavier, every breath more laborious. She moved quickly back toward the galley, her mind racing. She had always prided herself on reading passengers, on anticipating problems before they escalated, but this time her instincts had failed her in the worst possible way. She hadn't just mishandled the situation, she had disregarded protocol, insulted someone with influence, and cast a spotlight not just on herself, but on the company. The other crew members were already feeling the ripple. Dennis had been pulled aside by the captain and was now briefing the remaining attendants. No one questions her again. Not a word about the seat change, he instructed, his tone low but direct. She gets priority treatment. Anything she needs, you make it happen without hesitation. From here on out, she's not just a guest, she's the guest. The others nodded silently, exchanging worried glances. Even Emily Ross, the soft-spoken junior attendant, looked rattled. She had been kind to Jasmine, instinctively sensing something special, but now knowing the truth that kindness took on new weight. They had all witnessed a moment they didn't fully understand. Now they knew just how badly it had been mishandled. Back in seat 22B, Jasmine remained still, her eyes focused on the clouds drifting by. She hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, but everything around her had. The service shifted subtly. A blanket offered without request. A drink topped off before it emptied. The smallest gestures were amplified, now infused with an urgency that hadn't been there before. But Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't posture. She simply nodded when thanked, smiled when greeted, and returned to her notes as if nothing had happened. It was this quiet strength, this ability to command a room without raising her voice, that set her apart. She didn't need to say who she was. Now everyone knew. Jasmine Reed lifted the glass of water to her lips, with measured ease, the movement so fluid it seemed choreographed. She took a slow sip, then gently set the glass back onto the tray table, her fingers resting against the condensation on the cup, as if holding a pulse. Her eyes drifted toward the clouds outside, unbothered by the swirl of attention beginning to form around her. Nothing about her changed. Her posture remained straight, her breath, even her expression, unreadable. But there was a subtle shift in the air. Where once she was overlooked, now every glance from the crew came with nervous precision. Every movement near her space held the tension of unspoken awareness. Jasmine didn't acknowledge it. She didn't need to. She had stepped into quiet authority without uttering a word. Meanwhile, at the front of the plane, Kelly Monroe was unraveling. Her movements, once crisp and methodical, had turned jittery and imprecise. She dropped a napkin while preparing drinks, then fumbled a bottle of sparkling water, narrowly catching it before it hit the counter. Her smile had become mechanical, her hands shaky. Every time she looked up from her tasks, her eyes flicked toward the back of the cabin, toward row 22, where Jasmine sat, like a still point in a turning world. Kelly tried to recenter herself, reminding her mind to focus to recover, but it wasn't working. She couldn't stop replaying the captain's words: executive board member, stakeholder, policy architect. And now she couldn't stop wondering who else on the plane had noticed. As if answering that unspoken question, a ripple of realization had begun to stir among the passengers. They had seen Jasmine's calm during the relocation, observed the change in crew behavior, and now, as flight attendants came and went with subtle deference, whispers started to rise like steam. A man across the aisle leaned slightly toward his neighbor. "You see that woman back there? I think something's going on." Another passenger frowned. "They moved her from first class, didn't they?" "Yeah," the first man said, nodding, "but now they're treating her like royalty." The shift wasn't loud or disruptive. It was quiet, observational, and all the more powerful for it. The story was writing itself in real time. Kelly felt it too. She heard the tone of conversations shift, saw heads turning with more intention. Watched as the atmosphere she had once controlled slipped steadily from her grasp. Jasmine's presence had transformed from invisible to commanding, not because she demanded it, but because she didn't. And that was what truly unsettled Kelly. If Jasmine had been loud or indignant, it would have been easier to dismiss, easier to frame in her mind as a passenger acting out. But Jasmine hadn't raised her voice once. She had spoken with kindness, moved with grace, and let her silence carry weight. The more composed she remained, the more chaotic Kelly's inner world became. Jasmine, for her part, remained detached from the theater unfolding around her. She took another sip of water, jotted a brief note in her pad, and adjusted her scarf with elegant nonchalance. She didn't look behind or ahead. Her awareness was internal rooted, and yet she could feel the energy pressing in from the edges. She could sense Kelly's spiraling, could hear the soft hum of whispers becoming questions, but she allowed it to play out as it needed. To influence, she believed, wasn't something you threw around. It was something you let reveal itself. And now that reveal was underway, not by her design, but by the weight of consequence. The power dynamic had shifted entirely, and no one needed a formal announcement to feel it. Jasmine's serenity was no longer just remarkable. It was unnerving. It was unsettling in the way truth often is unshakable, undeniable, and dangerous to those who built their comfort on assumption. Kelly, once in control of the cabin's rhythm, now moved through it as if on foreign ground. Every step she took felt heavy, every breath a negotiation. And Jasmine? She simply remained elevated by stillness, commanding without confrontation, and holding the kind of quiet authority that no one dared to question any more. Kelly Monroe stood in the galley, staring at the chilled bottles of sparkling water in front of her, as if one of them held a way out of the mess she had created. Her hands trembled slightly as she selected a glass poured carefully and added a slice of lemon like she was crafting an offering. The hum of the aircraft around her was muted by the roar of her thoughts. Her confidence, once unshakable, had collapsed under the weight of revelation. Jasmine Reed wasn't just a passenger. She was a board-level figure. And now every misstep, every assumption, every word spoken too sharply or without due respect echoed louder than she could bear. But this gesture, this drink, this apology was her last attempt to regain some measure of control or at the very least dignity. The walk back to row 22 felt longer than the aisle itself. Each step forward was a step through thick fog. Her usual crisp stride was replaced by something slower, heavier. Kelly could feel the eyes of passengers on her, watching her with vague curiosity, some perhaps already aware, others sensing that something had shifted irreversibly. In her hand, the glass trembled ever so slightly. She rehearsed her lines in her mind, over and over, adjusting the tone, softening the edges. But when she reached Jasmine's row, and their eyes met, everything she had prepared dissolved into silence. Jasmine looked up serene as ever, her expression unreadable. The stillness in her gaze held weight. It was not anger. It was something far more powerful. Clarity. Miss Reed Kelly began, her voice softer than it had been all day. I wanted to offer this as an apology for earlier. She held out the glass of sparkling water like a peace offering. Jasmine's eyes flicked briefly to the drink, then back to Kelly. She took it with a small, polite nod, her fingertips steady and slow. There was no gratitude in her expression, no visible satisfaction, just acknowledgement. Kelly stood for a beat, hoping for some sign of forgiveness, some indication that the balance was restored, but what she got was something else entirely. Jasmine set the glass down on her tray table, then looked back up at Kelly, her voice calm and even. "It'll take more than a drink," she said simply. The sentence landed with quiet precision, clean, direct, and impossible to ignore. Kelly's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. For a moment, she forgot how to respond. It wasn't that Jasmine was being cruel or confrontational. Quite the opposite. There was no venom in her tone, no bitterness in her face. Only truth. That was what made it sting. Jasmine hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't accused or demanded. She had simply spoken a fact, and in doing so removed any illusion that the situation could be remedied with civility. Alone, Kelly's smile faltered. Of course, she managed to say, her voice barely audible now. "If there's anything else I can do." Jasmine leaned back in her seat, her eyes steady. "I believe the airline will know how to address this," she replied, her tone gentle but immovable. That was it. No rage, no scene, just quiet accountability. And that quietness was far more devastating than any public outburst could have been. Kelly stood there for a second longer, unsure whether to speak or retreat. Eventually, she chose the latter, turning and walking back up the aisle with quickened steps. Her face flushed, her stomach tight. This wasn't just about being wrong. It was about being seen as wrong, in a space where she once believed she was the enforcer of order. As Kelly reached the galley again, she leaned against the counter, breathing hard. The trembling had returned to her hands, and no amount of deep breathing could steady them. Dennis looked at her from across the narrow space, but said nothing. He didn't need to. He had seen enough. Kelly lowered her eyes and pressed her palms to the metal surface. She had offered a glass of sparkling water and a rehearsed apology, thinking it would restore balance. But Jasmine Reed had shown her otherwise. This wasn't a wound that could be covered with etiquette. This was a reckoning, and it had only just begun. The overhead chime sounded with a soft ding, followed by the captain's voice echoing through the cabin with his usual calm professionalism. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've begun our final descent into Atlanta. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and all tray tables are returned to their upright position." Around Jasmine Reed, passengers stirred, snapping shut laptops, adjusting carry-ons, and stretching legs stiffened from hours in the air. But Jasmine didn't move. She sat poised in 22B legs, crossed her notepad, tucked away in her bag, and her phone resting lightly in the palm of her hand. Her thumb hovered briefly over the keyboard, then tapped send on a message she had written earlier. "Be ready." The message flew through the airwaves with more weight than any turbulence the plane had encountered. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, but to the person receiving it, those two words meant preparation, accountability, and follow-through. Jasmine knew what was waiting on the ground, and she knew how quickly Skylink Aviation responded when board-level directives came through their channels. She wasn't worried about what would happen next, only that it happened correctly. While others around her looked forward to baggage claim and transportation logistics, Jasmine remained still, her thoughts several steps ahead. She had set everything in motion before the plane even left the tarmac. Now she simply had to let gravity do the rest. At the front of the plane, Kelly Monroe stood by the service station, her posture rigid, fingers curling around the edge of the counter as she watched the cabin wind down. Her stomach churned with anticipation, not of arrival, but of consequence. She had tried to reset the tone with an apology, a smile, a drink, but none of it had changed. What she knew deep down, this wasn't going away. The calls from HQ, the captain's instructions, the tight-lipped silence from Dennis, all of it pointed toward a reckoning that had now landed squarely on her shoulders. Every sound, every buckle click, every shuffle of shoes in the aisle felt like a countdown. She couldn't pause. The plane began to lower through the clouds, the city below coming into view through slits in the mist. Jasmine turned her head slightly to glance out the window, her expression calm and unreadable. There was no tension in her brow, no urgency in her breath. While passengers instinctively braced for landing, she remained rooted as if the descent meant something different to her, something inevitable and entirely in her favor. A few rows ahead, a businessman glanced back, eyes lingering on her face, perhaps sensing something he couldn't quite name. Others were starting to connect dots. The deference, the distance, the shift in power. Even in stillness, Jasmine radiated command. The wheels touched down with a soft thud, and the aircraft glided along the runway as the cabin filled with the low murmur of relieved conversations. A few passengers clapped. Others checked their watches already, mentally off the plane. The seatbelt sign pinged off, and people leapt up with routine urgency, grabbing bags, opening bins, lining up the aisle like eager dominoes. But Jasmine remained seated. She made no move for her bag, no attempt to stand. She simply watched as the crowd began to flow forward one by one, row by row. It was a kind of unspoken choreography, and she let them have it. She wasn't in a rush. Her moment would come when the plane was nearly empty and fully quiet. Near the front, Kelly stood frozen by the cabin door, her mouth dry, her hands damp. Every passing passenger offered a nod or a polite thank you, but her mind wasn't on courtesy anymore. It was on the final moments, on the possibility that Jasmine might say something, or worse, might say nothing at all. She watched the line grow shorter, inching closer to where Jasmine remained seated. The air around her felt thicker now, as if infused with electricity. She tried to smile, but her face refused to cooperate. She couldn't breathe deeply. She couldn't think clearly. She could only brace for whatever came next. And still, Jasmine waited, the aisle nearly empty now. Her phone returned to her bag, her scarf adjusted neatly around her neck. She stood slowly with the kind of grace that didn't seek attention but demanded it anyway. Every movement was deliberate, composed. She pulled her luggage down without a sound, placed it upright, and stepped forward toward the front of the plane, toward the moment that would punctuate this entire flight. But she didn't rush. She didn't posture. She simply walked calm and certain, the way someone walks when they know they're no longer being questioned, but watched, respected, and remembered. As the last few passengers filtered off, Flight 318, and the cabin grew quiet, Jasmine Reed stepped gracefully onto the jet bridge, her carry-on rolling behind her with barely a sound. She didn't look back. Not because she was avoiding anything, but because she didn't need to. The message had already been sent, the gears already turned. Every step she took now was measured not in distance, but in impact. The hum of the terminal greeted her like a subtle applause. She checked her phone briefly, then tucked it away and disappeared into the terminal's stream of travelers with the same grace she'd maintained from gate to gate. But for those still on the aircraft, Jasmine's presence lingered like the final note of a song that refused to fade. Two uniformed airport security officers appeared moments later at the end of the jet bridge. They moved with quiet authority, nodding briefly to the gate agent before stepping into the aircraft. Their presence was neither rushed nor confrontational, but unmistakably official. One officer glanced at the manifest on a tablet, while the other scanned the cabin with practiced calm. Then came the question, direct, precise, and heavy. "We're looking for Kelly Monroe." The crew froze. So did a few passengers who were lingering near the front, grabbing overhead bags or waiting to step into the aisle. It was a moment where time split between what had just happened and what was happening now. Kelly Monroe stood paralyzed near the galley, her breath caught in her throat. She had felt something coming. Yes, but not this. Not officers in uniform asking for her by name, not in front of her crew, her passengers, her career. "That's me," she said. Finally, her voice brittle as it broke the silence. The officers nodded. "Please come with us. We have a few questions regarding an onboard incident." The words were spoken with professional neutrality, but they might as well have been a verdict. Kelly swallowed hard and forced herself to nod. She stepped forward slowly, her limbs moving like they no longer belonged to her. Her feet felt too heavy. Her hands were trembling again. There was no time to collect her thoughts, no space for saving face. The silence that followed was unlike any other silence in her career. It wasn't the calm of landing or the routine quiet of a cabin powering down. It was the sound of every eye watching every breath held her fellow crew members stood still. Dennis, who had watched the situation unfold from the beginning, said nothing. He just looked at her with a complex mix of sympathy and resignation. Emily Ross's eyes widened slightly, one hand reflexively gripping the back of a passenger seat as if to steady herself. Even the passengers, some already halfway down the aisle, paused just long enough to understand what was happening, and when they understood, they said nothing, because there was nothing to say. As Kelly followed the officers off the aircraft, the walk down the jet bridge felt like a walk through judgment. She could feel the invisible weight of it pressing on her shoulders. The quiet was louder than any reprimand, the unspoken truth heavier than any shouted accusation. She had made a choice in the air, one based not on protocol, but on bias, and now on the ground that choice had arrived to greet her. No one tried to stop the officers. No one protested on her behalf, because everyone understood this was what accountability looked like. Not always loud, not always immediate, but inevitable. The aircraft door remained open for a moment longer, as if waiting for the air to clear. Then slowly the crew began to move again, checking the last rows, gathering stray items, preparing for the next flight. But the energy had changed. The story of Flight 318 was no longer about departure and arrival. It had become something else, something weightier. The crew didn't speak of it aloud, but they felt it. They had witnessed something rare, power without volume, justice without spectacle. And as the door finally closed behind the security officers and Kelly Monroe, it left behind a silence that wasn't empty, but full of consequence, full of clarity, and full of the echo of a name none of them would forget: Jasmine Reed. The room was small and sterile, tucked behind a row of frosted glass panels in a quiet corner of the airport's operations wing. The kind of room that didn't welcome comfort, but clarity. Kelly Monroe sat stiffly on a vinyl chair across from a narrow table, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Across from her, two uniformed officers stood by the door, while a third, dressed in a navy blazer with Skylink Aviation's insignia on the chest, entered with a folder in hand. The door shut with a soft click that sounded louder than it should have. Kelly tried to steady her breath, but the pressure in her chest only grew heavier. She had imagined what this moment might feel like, but imagining and experiencing were two very different things. The man in the blazer, director of passenger relations according to his badge, sat across from her and opened the folder without preamble. "Ms. Monroe," he began his tone. We've completed the initial review of the incident on Flight 318 involving Miss Jasmine Reed." He paused, glancing briefly at Kelly's face. "Before I proceed, you should know that Ms. Reed is not only a senior advisor to Skylink Aviation's executive board, she is also one of the airline's principal investors. She holds equity voting influence and serves on the committee that oversees employee conduct and customer experience policies." Kelly's lips parted, but no words came out. She felt like the floor beneath her had shifted, like the air had been pulled from the room. Jasmine hadn't just been important. She had been untouchable. The director continued his tone, cool but not cruel. "Based on your report and multiple passenger statements, your decision to reassign Ms. Reed was not supported by protocol. There was no seat duplication, no upgrade error, no behavioral issue. Your judgment was solely based on personal discretion and, frankly, on assumptions not rooted in company policy." He let that statement settle like dust in a room with no air. Kelly's throat tightened. She tried to form an explanation, a justification, anything but nothing. She could say would survive the truth now laid bare. The facts were too clean, the impact too undeniable. She had acted without cause and, worse, without awareness of who she had acted against. He pulled out a sheet and slid it across the table. "Effective immediately," he said, "you are suspended from duty, pending the outcome of a formal disciplinary hearing." Kelly stared at the paper, unable to reach for it. "The hearing is scheduled for Monday morning, 9:00 a.m. here at corporate headquarters. A representative from Human Resources will be in contact to provide further details. Until then, you are not to report for any flight assignments." His voice remained calm, but behind every word was a tone of finality. It wasn't theatrical. It didn't need to be. It was administrative, clinical, devastating. "Do you have any questions?" he asked. Kelly shook her head, slowly, mechanically. He gathered his documents and stood. "Someone will escort you out. We'll be in touch with that." He turned and left the room, leaving Kelly in a silence she couldn't escape. She stared down at the notice on the table, her own name printed in bold at the top. For years she had worn that name like a badge. Kelly Monroe, senior flight attendant, the one who kept things under control, who knew every procedure by heart. But now it was just ink on a paper that marked the beginning of the unraveling. The silence in the room grew louder. Her thoughts tangled. She hadn't been malicious, she told herself. Just cautious, but even she knew. Now what she called caution had been bias, and it had come at a cost. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. One of the officers stepped back in. "Ready?" he asked gently. She nodded, rising slowly to her feet. As she followed him down the corridor, her reflection appeared briefly in a pane of glass, a uniformed figure, still neat in appearance, but with the posture of someone carrying the weight of too many regrets. The hallway stretched out before her, a long line of fluorescent lights and echoing footsteps. She walked in silence, her future, as uncertain as the grey ceiling tiles above her. For the first time in her career, she didn't feel like a steward of order. She felt like a lesson, and the one delivering it had never raised her voice, only her standards. The sun cast a golden light through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Skylink Aviation's executive conference suite, reflecting off polished oak tables and chrome fixtures. Jasmine Reed sat at the head of the long boardroom table, not as a guest, but as someone who belonged. She wore a slate-grey blazer tailored to perfection and carried only a single folder in front of her, one that held far more than facts. It held purpose. Across from her sat Richard Lane, Skylink's CEO, a man known for his strategic mind and tight-lipped composure. Today, however, even he looked uneasy. He cleared his throat as he opened the meeting. His voice measured. "Ms. Reed?" "Jasmine. Thank you for coming in so quickly." Jasmine met his eyes without hesitation. "We need to talk about what happened on Flight 318, she said evenly. and more importantly, what happens next. Richard leaned forward slightly, folding his hands. I've reviewed the incident reports. What happened on that flight was unacceptable. We failed you not just as a passenger, but as a partner. I want you to know we take full responsibility. Jasmine didn't flinch. Acknowledgement is important, she said, but I'm not here for apologies. I'm here for reform. She opened her folder and slid a document across the table, outlined in bullet points, structured like a strategy brief. This isn't just about me. It's about a culture that made what happened possible. If it happened to me, someone who sits on your board, imagine what's happening to passengers with no voice. Her words weren't angry. They were precise, and that made them impossible to dismiss. Richard took the paper and scanned it. Listed were 5 immediate reforms, including mandatory bias, training annual cultural competence certification, and the establishment of a passenger equity ombudsman within Skylink's corporate structure. These are strong measures, he said. And overdue, Jasmine replied. Every frontline employee needs to understand not just policy, but impact. We cannot afford to let bias wear a uniform. Richard nodded slowly. I agree. I'll present these measures to the executive board today, and we'll begin implementation by the end of the quarter. Jasmine's expression didn't change, but there was something in the stillness of her posture, a subtle approval, quiet but resolute. She wasn't here to grandstand. She was here to build something better. The conversation shifted briefly as Richard brought up the flight crew's conduct. There was one detail I wanted to mention. He said, flipping through a separate report, Emily Ross, a junior flight attendant. She showed you courtesy and professionalism when no one else did. Jasmine's gaze softened slightly. Yes, she was the only one who treated me like a person before knowing my title. Richard closed the folder and smiled faintly. We've taken note. She'll be formally recognized this week and is being promoted to a senior in-flight experience advisor. Jasmine nodded. Good. Rewarding the right behavior is just as important as correcting the wrong. The meeting lasted another 45 minutes, but the energy in the room had already shifted. Jasmine didn't need to raise her voice or slam her fist on the table. Her authority came not from position, but from principle. She had turned an incident of humiliation into a mandate for change. And Richard Lane, to his credit, understood the weight of that opportunity. By the time Jasmine stood to leave, the reforms had already begun rolling into motion. HR notified internal communications, drafted department heads scheduled for immediate training briefings. Skylink was shifting quietly but definitively. And Jasmine? She simply shook Richard's hand and exited the room with the same calm dignity that had carried her through the storm. Outside the boardroom, the mood was different. Emily Ross stood by the elevator in her newly pressed uniform, waiting nervously for her meeting with HR. She hadn't been told the full story, only that she was being recognized. When the doors opened and Jasmine stepped out, their eyes met. Jasmine gave a small, knowing nod. Congratulations, she said softly. Emily's eyes widened. Thank you, ma'am, she replied, barely finding the words. Jasmine didn't linger. She walked on her heels, tapping softly against the marble floor, the echo of change behind her, not loud, not boastful, but firm and growing. A culture was being rewritten, one decision at a time. A few weeks later, Jasmine Reed stepped into the terminal of Skylink Aviation's westbound corridor. Her pace was unhurried, her expression calm, but her eyes were observant. As she approached the gate, she noticed subtle but meaningful differences. Genuine smiles from the staff at check-in flight attendants, greeting passengers without scanning them for status or assumption, and a general air of attentiveness that hadn't always been there. She boarded the aircraft quietly and took her seat in first class, declining an early offer of champagne with a gentle shake of her head. As the crew moved through their pre-flight rituals, Jasmine sat back, her hands resting on her lap, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she had to be on guard. Midway through the flight, she noticed the change even more clearly. A young mother struggled with her toddler. A few rows ahead, within moments, an attendant crouched beside her, offering both reassurance and extra snacks without hesitation. Another passenger, elderly and traveling alone, was gently helped with his blanket and given extra water. These weren't scripted gestures. They were human ones, and Jasmine, watching it all unfold, felt something stir within her. It wasn't pride, not yet, but a soft, growing affirmation. The culture was shifting. Not dramatically, not overnight, but enough to see the outline of progress. She reached for her notebook and wrote just 2 words in the corner of a blank page. Keep going. Across town, in a modest brick building that housed a small but passionate non-profit, Kelly Monroe sat in a shared workspace, cluttered with educational materials and folded event flyers. The organization, called Equal Ground, specialized in workplace equity training for underserved industries, aviation among them. Kelly was no longer in uniform. No more wings pinned to her chest, no polished announcements over the intercom. Her world now was coffee-stained policy documents and scheduling community workshops. Her name, once etched in gold on a crew roster, was now printed on a volunteer badge. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't even comfortable, but it was honest, and after everything Kelly had come to value, honesty more than control. Her first few days had been difficult. The shame of being let go, the sting of being made an example, it had all settled heavily on her. But in those quiet hours between workshops, as she listened to others talk about bias inclusion and the weight of invisible systems, she began to understand. She stopped seeing herself as a victim of exposure and started seeing herself as a product of a culture that hadn't taught her better. So now she listened more than she spoke. She asked questions instead of asserting answers, and slowly she began to build something, not a new career yet, but a new way of showing up in the world. Not as the gatekeeper she had once been, but as a bridge. Back on the plane, Jasmine looked out the window at the clouds beneath her. They rolled by in endless sheets of silver and white, soft and untouched. She didn't know where Kelly was, or what had become of her. She hadn't followed up, hadn't needed to. But in her heart, she hoped Kelly had chosen to reflect rather than resist, because change. Jasmine knew wasn't just for systems. It was for people. It had to be. The real fight wasn't in forcing apologies. It was in making room for accountability to lead to transformation. And while not everyone would rise to that, some would, and those few would help turn a moment of pain into momentum for something better. A flight attendant approached her row, a young man this time who leaned in with genuine warmth. "Ms. Reed, just checking in. Can I get you anything at all?" Jasmine smiled softly. "Just some tea, thank you." He nodded and walked away, unaware of how much his small kindness meant. Jasmine leaned back in her seat and closed her eyes for a moment. She didn't need recognition. She didn't want headlines. She just wanted assurance that what happened on Flight 318 wouldn't repeat itself, not to her and not to anyone else. And in that moment, with the quiet hum of the cabin and the weightless calm of cruising altitude, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Far below, in that small non-profit office, Kelly stood in front of a group of young airline recruits. Her voice was steadier now, her message clearer. What you assume about someone at first glance, she told them, can cost you more than just your job. It can cost you your integrity. So lead with curiosity, not judgment. You'll be surprised how far that takes you. Some students nodded. Others looked thoughtful. And Kelly, for the first time in months, felt that maybe she was doing something right. She had lost one path, but maybe she had found a better one. The city lights flickered far below as Jasmine Reed leaned against the wide glass windows of her office, sipping the last of her evening tea. The room was quiet, the hum of the air conditioner, the only sound breaking the stillness. Outside, the skyline stretched in all directions, shimmering towers, winding highways, and planes occasionally blinking in descent. From this height, everything seemed slower, calmer, like the world had taken a breath. Jasmine watched it all in silence, her mind returning to that flight, to seat 2A, to seat 22B, to every unspoken moment that had defined the invisible lines of power, perception, and principle. The incident had passed, yes, but its echo still lived in her. Because Jasmine knew that real change was never one event. It was a practice, a commitment, a persistence. Her email pinged soft and brief. She turned toward the screen and opened the message with cautious curiosity. The sender's name stopped her. Kelly Monroe. The subject line was plain: apology and reflection. Jasmine clicked, "Dear Ms. Reed, I've struggled with how to begin this email because no opening line can fully carry the weight of what I want to say. What I did on Flight 318 was wrong, not just procedurally, but ethically. I acted on assumption. I used discretion where I should have used discernment. I looked at you and didn't see who you were not because of your status, but because of my own blind spots. Since that day, I've been stripped of a title I once valued and placed into a space I never expected. A space of learning, listening, and deep personal reckoning. I now work for equal ground training new professionals in the very equity I failed to uphold. And it's because of you. Thank you for your grace. Thank you for not meeting my failure with fury, but with clarity. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know I see it now, and I am changing." Jasmine read the message twice, then a third time, each line unfolding like a quiet confession. She didn't feel vindicated. That wasn't what she'd ever sought. But there was something undeniably human in Kelly's words. Sincere or earned. Jasmine closed the laptop for a moment, letting the silence return. In her experience, apologies were often transactional, crafted to save face, protect reputations. But this one was different. It didn't deflect or soften. It named the harm and claimed it. And that mattered more than any policy change ever could. Because while systems needed to evolve, people did too, and that required courage. She reopened her laptop and began typing each word, slow, intentional. Dear Ms. Monroe, thank you for your message. Accountability is not weakness. It is the beginning of strength. I hope you continue on this path, not because of what happened to me, but because of what could happen to others if we don't lead better. Change isn't loud, but it is lasting when we choose to grow through it. I wish you well. She hit send and closed the device, then returned to the window, exhaling a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The lights below glimmered as they always had, but somehow they looked a little softer now, like they too had witnessed something shift. The next day, Jasmine would speak at a conference on corporate responsibility. The audience would expect numbers, frameworks, and initiatives, and she would give them those things. But before that, she would tell them this story, not to highlight her own strength, but to illuminate how quiet injustice happens in plain sight and how we respond to it reveals who we are. She would tell them about a flight, about an aisle, about a choice, about an apology. And most of all, she would tell them that legacy isn't what we leave behind. It's what we change while we're still here. If this story moved you, we invite you to join the conversation here at Deep Inside HQ, where we go beyond headlines to uncover the human truths behind corporate systems, personal choices, and quiet revolutions. Subscribe for more real, thought-provoking stories that challenge assumptions and inspire change. Leave a comment, share your reflections, and help us build a community grounded in accountability, empathy, and progress. Because here we don't just tell stories, we shine a light on the ones that can change lives.